first time you're coming to the Salon du Livre?
No, I think the first time was 18 years ago. It's a long time.
You have now a new book
Yes.
here at Diable Vauvert.
Yes.
I'd like to know how many months a year does it take to write this book?
About a year and a half of actual writing and an unspecifically long time of thinking before the writing.
In this book, particularly, you have many characters which are interacting. How do you work? Do you make a plan, or is it your thought?
No, I try to allow the characters in the individual sequences to direct the movement. And I find that's a more satisfactory result if I try to construct the plot consciously, it becomes too mechanical. And so working through the characters, I find, yields a richer result.
Can we say that in your books, generally, the trip is more important than the end or the final focus of the book?
Well, probably, yes. I mean, it is for me in the writing. If the journey isn't adequately satisfying, then some plot point at the end won't work. You know, in Hollywood, when you write a screenplay to contract for a studio, they have to know in advance exactly how it ends, and then I've done that, and I found that incredibly unsatisfying. You just fill in the movement, connect the dots until the end. I prefer not to know what the conclusion will be, and to allow the characters and the surroundings to reveal that to me as I'm writing.
To speak about Hollywood, you have many novels adapted from the time. Now there is a new one, on which Hollywood is working, as you said.
Oh, well, my career in Hollywood has not been very satisfying in terms of having actual films produced. I've had many adaptations and very little in the way of film. I think I suspect I'm something. I'm like Elmore Leonard in that regard.
What do you think about the movie like Johnny Mnemonic or Hotel New York, for example?
Well, those are very different for me because I actually wrote the first screenplay of Johnny Mnemonic, and I was very involved with the director, and I was on the set and involved with the production. But with New Rose, I had nothing to do with it. I watched Abel, from a distance, watched Abel Ferrara make his film, and really when I went to the theater to see it, that was the first time I had any idea what he was doing, which I think is a more satisfactory experience for the author of the original text, because I had no responsibility.
It's weird because I think that the work of Ferrara is weirdly or more near view of your.
It's closer.
Than Johnny.
It was closer, but the real story with Johnny is very strange. The story of the production is very was very complicated. The film you saw is not the film we shot. It was the film we shot, very radically reworked by Sony, the studio, to fit what they assumed their needs were. So my original intention with Johnny was that it would be this sort of dark comedy, and it was not shot as a serious action adventure. It was a sort of dark but light piece of science fiction.
This project arrived too soon?
It arrived, in some ways it did arrive too soon, because with all the resources of Sony ImageWorks, they were unable to provide anything like the cyberspace effects we needed. We had to go outside the system and hire artists, like hire graphic artists in Boston to work with these incredibly primitive CGI systems that they were doing remarkable things with, because they were crazy artists, but the people in the studio couldn't get it. And at one point we had all of the cyberspace effects were on one hard drive in Boston, and if the power had failed, we would have lost it all. We had no way, it was too big, there was nothing to save it all. So there was a guy sleeping beside this thing to try to keep it happy. And like the whole picture depended on that. So it was before its time. It was in some ways a great deal of fun to make, though. I really enjoyed the experience of being so involved with it and seeing what was going on. And it's unusual. Like, the screenwriters and writers of the original material are not, in the American system, not allowed that degree of access.
How was it to write some episodes of shows like XFiles?
Well, XFiles was my only experience with that, and it was extremely satisfying. It's much better than feature films, because there was more freedom. I could write it, Chris Carter could approve it, and then it was shot. So it took, once we had the script, we would have the episode in a few weeks. It would be completed. With something like Johnny Mnemonic, it was like 3 or 4 years from writing the script, and all sorts of politics.
And to not have the final results you want at the beginning.
Yeah, and to not have the control. So I was happier with Kill Switch, the first episode I did, than I was with First-Person Shooter, the second one. By the time we did the second one, the X-Files production had left Vancouver, where I live, and had returned to Los Angeles. The budget for that episode was enormous. The budget for that episode was probably more than the total budget for Ferrara's Euros Hotel. And just having that sort of weight and the sets and locations and things, suddenly it was like being back in feature films.
As we spoke about cinema, I would like to know if you consider Blade Runner like a cyberpunk movie.
Oh, well, I'm ambivalent about the term cyberpunk, but I think that Blade Runner was a absolutely revolutionary piece of science fiction, cinema or not. It's just as a piece of science fiction, it was particularly in the United States, because the American future as in, science fiction as popular culture in the United States had never considered the past. So the classic American future is the city that's completely new. There are no elements of the past, and that's a very old-fashioned and very American way of looking at the future. Blade Runner was the first time Americans were confronted with a future United States that had the complexity and its visual backstory of Europe, where people take it for, in a European city, you take it for granted that the past doesn't simply disappear. That as history goes on, the past remain, bits of the past remain, and you operate in that context. And Blade Runner had that context in every frame, and I think Blade Runner was probably more influential in that way than any other piece of science fiction in any media in my lifetime. I think it was an incredibly important turning point.
To speak about Vancouver and part of your life, you left the US to go to Canada. Was it a radical political opposition from you, or a wish to live not in the US, or
it had more to do. It wasn't really political. I think at the time I would probably have claimed that it was political, because that would have been the cooler position. But in fact, I just wandered into it. I went to Toronto in 1967 with no idea whether I'd be there for one night or, but I certainly didn't expect to stay for a year or two, as I eventually wound up doing. And while I was there, I was eligible for the draft. And I suppose if I had been drafted, I would have just stayed in Canada. But in fact, for whatever reason, they never drafted me, and I then moved back to the United States. I was in the United States for about 2 years. And it was at that point, and still eligible for the draft, and at that point, I realized that in some ways I'd been having a better time in Toronto. So it was sort of, it was more a hedonistic decision than a political decision. Toronto was a better party for me. And I realized that somehow it was working better for me. When I went back to the United States, I felt a bit lost. But the people in Toronto who had actually had to make the decision to avoid the draft, the Americans, were too serious for me, and their world was too sad. Really, it was very sad. They were under enormous stress. There was some of them committed suicide. They were serious and seriously political, and I felt completely lost and out of my depth with those people. The people I found that I identified with were the German draft dodgers, who only had to stay out of Germany and stay off the dole for a year or two, and then they were free. They could go back, and they were having a good time. So I wound up having German friends who I identified with their position more. But I don't know what I would have done if they had drafted me. I mean, I wasn't the most emotionally together young man, and if they had drafted me, I might have gone.
Speaking about party, we know you are fond of...
Maybe you want to drink
coffee?
a bit of coffee, no?
You've got the right.
Yeah, we have
Switch
time.
to coffee. Okay. Can I drink coffee and talk?
Yeah. No problem.
Okay. It is a website after all.
Yeah. It's real life.
Casual and
It's real life.
realistic.
Yeah.
It's real life.
Speaking about party, we know and we read in your book that you are fond of music, of rock and roll and even punk music.
Yeah.
Did you discover this kind of music very young, or by a teenager? How do you come? What are the groups you're listening?
I was there when it, I'm old now. Like in 2 days I'm 60, so I'm old. And so I was there. It was all, I remember going, I would go and buy Bob Dylan records at the only record store in my small town in Virginia, and I was probably the only person buying those first Bob Dylan records. So, and when I went to Toronto, the week I arrived was the week that Sgt. Pepper's was released. So I had all of that generational experience of 60s music. And then I had the subsequent experience of pop music in America becoming really terrible, and as we moved into the 70s, and it sort of got uglier, and the music got really bad. Then I was very lucky in 1977 that I happened to go back to Toronto on my first visit in a number of years, and across the street from my friend's apartment there was a sort of festival of punk music. And I had no idea that this existed, so I heard drums across the street, and I was staying with the guys who had been my old hippie buddies, and I said, what's that across the street? And they said, don't go, it's complete shit. It's these kids with short hair and little ties, and it's just nonsense, don't waste your time. So I immediately walked over, and I thought, this is amazing. And I got, I was getting the cassettes and things. And when I went back to Vancouver, I said, there's this thing going on in Toronto and California with these kids making this music. Everybody the people my age sort of went, maybe. But then another friend of ours came back from London the same week with all of the Sex Pistols records and all of the fanzines, and so we realized, this is happening everywhere. So I became very fond of it and very interested in it, but I was already too old to be a part of it. I would go to the concerts and stand at the edge and kind of, yay, go kids. But I used it a few, that was about the time that I was starting to write, and I took it very enthusiastically into the text, and so I was using the culture of that music to contribute to the texture of my features, and so it was a very timely discovery.
I have always the feeling that sometimes you're writing a novel like if it was a song.
I think so. I'm a frustrated lyricist, and I'm not musical, and I know from serious attempts that I'm not a lyricist. but I use some sense of
Rhythm.
yeah, something. I know when I get to the end of a chapter or the end of a paragraph. Somehow I don't know, but I know when it's. If it doesn't work, I have to go back and. There's something about the way it moves, and I think that the lyricists I've most enjoyed, the songwriters I've most enjoyed are songwriters who deal very strongly with narrative, so that the songs are stories.
Yeah.
In many of your books, and in the last one, there are always a lot of characters which are interacting together. And you're always using the technology in your background of your subject. How do you create this kind of melting pot between your character, the technologies you want to use, the story you want to write?
Well, having the template of the multiple viewpoints and alternate chapters from multiple viewpoints has always been very important to me, because it somehow creates the rest of it, or it creates a ground in which the rest of it seems to naturally happen. That the perception, the differing perceptions of these characters and the differing degrees to which they are perceiving the other characters through various screens of technology seems to arise quite naturally from that sort of system. And with pattern recognition, I made a deliberate decision to limit that point of view. So pattern recognition is perceived almost entirely through Case's point of view, and it happens very much for her in an approximation of real time. And I found that incredibly difficult to do, and I completely lost my sense of timing. So I had to consult constantly with various first readers, and I would say, this chapter's been going on forever. It can't be this long. This is too slow, isn't it? And they said, no, it's moving right along. But my sense of timing had become so accustomed to cutting away to another character that it was very challenging. And with Spook Country, I went back to the multiple viewpoints and cutting away, I think because the story seemed demanding. I couldn't find another way to tell it.
In this last novel, Spook Country, you have let's say 4 characters which are very important, and they are not all. I'm always surprised that in your novel there is not so much people older. You're using teenager, kids, 20, 30 people years old, not more.
Well, there are older people in
the background.
Yeah,
deciding or
in the background. I think that's because I started with characters. When I started writing, I started with characters who were closer to my own age at the time, and by sticking with them, it provides me at least with some kind of ongoing perspective. If I aged the viewpoint characters as I age myself, I think I'd lose something. But I don't know. It's hard to explain. But that may change
in the future.
Yeah, it may change in the future.
I'd like to know. We know you have you lost your mother and your father very soon, but and you read very soon and you read a lot.
Yeah.
You said that you passed more time reading and writing than an American watching the TV,
Yeah.
for example.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is it the same? Actually, are you still reading a lot, and what kind of books are you reading?
You know, the readings, my book reading space over the past decade or so has been progressively invaded by the web. So I now probably spend as much time looking at and reading websites as the average American spends watching television, and comparatively little time reading. But I've found that writing and reading for me seem to occur in very much the same part of the brain. So after writing for a day, I don't want to go to the other chair and settle down with someone's novel, no matter how good it is. So writing has taken over, also like very much taken over from reading. And as I get older, I find less fiction that really works for me. And I don't know what that is. I used to be much more flexible when under it. If it was a novel, I could read it. But now there's relatively little that I've found that really works for me. Otherwise, I find it more satisfying to read nonfiction. And nonfiction,
biography.
well, history, kind of the stranger byways of history. And nonfiction has become a very vital form in English over the last 20 years or so. A lot of very interesting things being written.
When you wrote the different engines with Bruce Sterling, how was it? How do you work together on this book, which is a kind very different from your classical subjects?
Well, one thing that funny about it now, or seems quaint about it now, is it was a pre-internet, a pre-email collaboration, and I was in Vancouver and Bruce was, and we did it by fax and by mailing big floppies, thick stacks of big thick.
The old time, good old times.
It was the old days. And we had a rule. Bruce worked out a brilliant protocol for our collaboration, and that was that the stack of floppies at any moment constituted the only true text. So any printouts that either of us had made of earlier versions, we weren't allowed to access. The stack was the thing. Either of us had the full permission to go into the stack of floppies and change anything previously, except that we could not replace it with some previous version. All previous versions put it back in so that it always moved forward. And after when we began, there was my difference engine voice and Bruce's difference engine voice. But as we proceeded with that system, it began, that distinction began to blur. And there was another voice. There was a third. There was a third narrative voice emerging, and that was extraordinary. And Bruce had more confidence in the third writer that I did. I thought the third writer was mad for a long time, and perhaps he was. But then it became a really pile of fiction and newspaper stories and mining it for details. And there's so much crazy detail that we could never have made up. It's a description of the contents of a guy hanging in bird cages and things directly from British papers of the period and British pulp fiction.
Sterling 2 years ago in a French science fiction festival. Do you think this man is...
I think he's one of the geniuses of fiction in our day, and he's an extraordinary. He's a human being. As I met him in 1981, and he's always been, very much. He seems to have come into the world that which you encounter, and not everyone is able to handle that. The collaboration was called distance. As in the end, he came to Vancouver, so we were sort of doing the final adjustments, and it was just like, it was fun, but it was exhausting. It's incredibly, it was not just a memorable example of someone who straddles the science and art sides of and someone find that. You don't find somebody of 20th century plastic arts and then give one on quantum mechanics and not people, and he references, but he's so brilliant that it's exhausting and terrifying, and people know. He's amazing, and I really have not run into anyone. The only other person I've ever met who's in Sterling's caliber that way, but who has a very different presentation, would be Brian Eno, who's like just insanely smart and just like easily one of the most intelligent beings I've ever met, and is simultaneously a star. It's just such a peculiar combination.
Speaking about pop stars, but he's not really a star. Maybe. You talk a lot about iPod.
Yeah.
So, are you Mac or PC, and what do you think is why are you speaking so much of the iPod?
Because I'm piggybacking on their market. Actually, it would have been probably more realistic if I had the information being smuggled on those really inexpensive little Chinese-made keyring cameras, which will hold as much information. But by going for the iPod instead, I'm able to appropriate all the millions of dollars of marketing research that Mac has spent on creating a tiny iconic object, and it rings differently in the text. So when you see the iPod on the at the beginning of the novel, it has a completely different resonance than a $5 keyring camera, and it isn't. It isn't there because I think that iPods are particularly cool. It's there because iPods are characteristic, iconic objects of the moment.
If I hold your text from the beginning to the last one, to speak countries, I get the feeling that you're writing more and more on the present, and less about the future.
Well, I mean, one can't really write the future. Writing about when we say writing about the future, we're speaking from a cultural convention of science fiction and futurism. I knew when I began to write science fiction that all science fiction can only be read historically as being about the day in which it was written. As soon as you imagine and publish it, it begins to acquire, it instantly starts to acquire quaintness, and it moves sideways away from where the real future would be. And if you're lucky, there'll be just some degree of triangulation between your imaginary future and where the real future goes, and then people will say, he's prescient, he predicted this, but really it goes sideways. And I was self-conscious about that, whereas I think a lot of my contemporaries in science fiction didn't realize that was going on. So I always assumed that Neuromancer was in some very primary and profound way about 1981, the year in which I began to write it, and so I was comfortable with that. With the second set of books, with the bridge that began with Virtual Light, I cranked the imaginary future convention in much closer. Actually, as I recall, set about now. It's about 2007, 2008, and what by now is a completely alternate history of the world. But I also did something that I never told anyone, I never announced, but that gave me considerable, and that's that I cast them with people from the time in which they were written. Like, the characters are all 90s people, and they're like 90s people playing roles in a science fiction film. But I'd make the effort to even what it would really be like, so that someone like Rydell in the cop protagonist, he's really a 90s guy. He speaks 90s English. He's just living in this very fully real, nicely realized Blade Runner set, and reacting to this stuff. And that gave me a lot of satisfaction. Critics never noticed. No one seemed to notice that was going on. And from doing that, it became for me a logical step to use exactly the same toolkit on a present that hadn't really been modified at all, except to the extent that I was looking at it through the lenses and the periscopes and things that I had developed to present something that would be presented as more like science fiction. So for me, I understood the convention of presenting the imaginary future, but it was never very important to me. in some of the way that I know that I've had like many readers over the years who I'm sure have gone to my work for the imaginary technology, and I've met some of them. They've obviously enjoyed that very much, but there was less thought, less creative effort for me. It was just very easy for me to do the imaginary technology, and I would sort of do it in mind. I'd just sort of put it off to the side. Wasn't that important to me? It didn't require effort. It was like molecule thick. It's the wonderful illusion of one of the great things about prose fiction is that with a few words you can suggest something that an intelligent and creative reader will instantly turn into this sort of fabulously detailed object that he or she can then like totally fall in love with. And so I'd meet people who really, really want the Ono Sendai Cyberspace deck, and obviously have this really clear vision of it. And they see it in 3 dimensions in full color and fully functioning and incredibly sexy. And for me, it was just the words on paper.
Talking about GP, to say that people can reappropriate the world they are losing through the technologies. I'm not sure. I don't know what we're losing or what we're gaining, and part of that comes from having had to develop a profoundly agnostic view of technology. So when I see a new piece of technology now, I try not to make moral judgments. We won't know. Technology is generally very, very neutral until human beings do something with it. Even apparently very evil forms of technology can have conceive of benevolent uses in some. You can use nuclear bombs to drive starships, things like that. But I'm losing I think I may have just totally lost the question. But what was the question quickly? Remind me. The way you use a lot geohacking, mapping, and.
Well, with the geohacking, I was looking for a way. I was looking for a way to suggest that what we used to call cyberspace has now simply become here. If we could see all of the packets of information that are being exchanged by the various units in this building, we'd be in this incredibly dizzy blur of information. And when I wrote Neuromancer, cyberspace such as it existed was sort of there, and it was very exotic and very interesting. And we were here. But now, I think, we hardly even need the word cyberspace anymore, but all of that stuff is here, and we're interacting in it, and there has become the absence of connectivity. There is the hotel with no Wi-Fi, or when the battery dies on my phone, and suddenly I'm out of the net, and we're still the in-between. We're the in-between version of the species. I think that our grandchildren, what they'll find most quaint about us is that we insisted on making a distinction between the real and the virtual. Mm-hmm. I don't think they'll make that distinction, and they'll find our moral quibbles about it very kind of strange 17th century.
William Gibson, thank you very much for this interview.
Thank you.